Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour. I am Sandeep Pai, a former journalist with Hindustan Times and now an energy researcher at the University of British Columbia.
And I'm Shreya Jay, journalist with Business Standard newspaper in Delhi, writing and reporting on the energy sector.
Together, we are really excited to co host a new podcast on India's energy transition, the India Energy Hour. This podcast is hosted by 101 Reporters, an innovative news agency that connects grassroots reporters and media houses to bring out untold stories. The show is produced by Tejas Dayanand Sagar of 101 Reporters.
In this podcast, we want to unpack and document India's energy transition. We will interview leading energy, development, and climate experts from academia, civil society, and the government. Through these interviews, we will explore the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities in the energy transition unfolding in India. We will examine the role of government, finance, social justice, and science. Over time, we will feature other countries of the global south as well.
The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2040, close to 270 million people would be added to India's urban population. How fast India urbanizes and industrializes over the coming decades and the policies that govern these processes will be crucial for the country's energy future and climate mitigation efforts at the global level. To understand the implications of India's rapid urbanization on energy demand and climate, we interviewed Siddharth Singh, co-lead author of India Energy Outlook 2021, published by the International Energy Agency. Siddharth has researched and written extensively about global and Indian energy sector policies.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to the show, Siddharth. Welcome to the Indian Energy Podcast, and thanks a lot. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest and joining us here. We are sure that we will have a very interesting dialogue over the issues that we are going to discuss. But before we jump into this very interesting discussion, we would want to start with you and your journey. You have a very interesting career trajectory. You work with the IEA currently. You have been a book author as well, which I must say has been a definitive work on the subject of air pollution. So can you start by telling us about yourself? Where are you from? What did you study? How did you decide to end up researching on this subject, please?
Sure, of course. Firstly, thanks very much, Shreya and Sandeep, for having me on this. I think, I've been listening to your podcast for a while and following your work in general. So it's good to be having a conversation on all these kind of, interdisciplinary issues that we have been working on over the years. I don't know where to begin, honestly. I think, let me just start with my pre-energy life and perhaps, walk towards how we got here. In fact, some of this, pre-energy life that I've had, still influences my thinking to this date, on energy, on climate. So hopefully, all of this somewhere kind of comes together. So I was actually born in a small village in Rajasthan. Okay. It's a typical Rajasthani village, as you'd imagine. Back in the day, you'd see many turbans, handlebar mustaches, gagra cholis, camels, obviously with a lot of casteism and patriarchy thrown in. And, perhaps, obviously important to our conversation today, there was also near universal use of biomass, back in the day for cooking, especially. There were water shortages. There's obviously barely any electricity. In fact, our village was one of the first few villages in Rajasthan to get electricity simply because there was an industry right there next to it, which meant that, of course, supply was much better than surrounding villages, but still not nearly adequate. My father he's a government official, or rather he was a government official before he retired. So that took us to Andhra Pradesh, where lived in a bunch of places. Honestly, I've lost count of the number of cities and towns I've lived in, but, in Andhra Pradesh, the prominent ones were Vizag, Warangal, and Hyderabad. Hyderabad is where I finished my schooling. And, right after finishing this, like my 12th standard, as we call it here in India, my interest kind of veered towards architecture. So I've always had this fascination for and I believe an eye for well-designed spaces. When I say spaces, I don't just mean buildings. I mean neighborhoods. I mean cities. I mean just the way we kind of experience life. And of course, this kind of also plays in when I think about spaces today, when I think about energy and urbanization and so on. This kind of, I guess, I have a passion that goes beyond just the numbers, beyond just what the texts say. Anyway, in Hyderabad, the academic culture is such that the students who succeed end up becoming doctors and engineers, and anyone else is considered a failure pretty much. I mean, socially that's kind of like a given. So I was kind of socially pressured into not taking up architecture. I ended up studying engineering all the way in Uttar Pradesh. So this was because my father got transferred to Delhi, and UP in the form of Greater Noida was an option for me. But I didn't like it at all. Like I honestly, I was still interested in architecture and other things, and engineering was not for me. Although I didn't really do badly in class, but I decided to leave that to take up economics at the University of Delhi. And it wasn't a great college, but it had a few excellent teachers. And as in Delhi University, the coursework is pretty much standard across. Now, undergraduate level economics isn't the real deal, of course, but it still gives me it gave me my very first understanding of a non-scientific subject, which I wanted to study further. And few of these concepts that I was introduced to back then, in my undergrad days, are still very important to my thinking. As an example, like there's this idea of development is freedom by Amartya Sen, who talks about the nature of freedom itself, and how our understanding of development kind of can be shaped by understanding the need for humans to access markets, to travel, to not face discrimination, and so on and so forth. And I think that kind of, to this date, is something that I've used. It's a topic I kind of dwelled into even deeply in my book, The Great Smog of India, which fortunately I had the chance encounter with Amartya Sen himself at a hotel in Delhi. So we kind of got to discuss this as well. So it's funny how things kind of just get connected in strange ways. Anyway, I mean, since then, studying economics, I think things just rolled into place, and I kind of found myself in the energy world. I think my first exposure to energy that I actually still remember to this date was from this movie Syriana, which starred George Clooney and Matt Damon. And that movie was a geopolitical thriller based in the Middle East, on the dirty world of oil, and the violence, conflicts, and rags to riches stories, mergers and acquisitions, monopoly capitalism, all of that. So I honestly wanted to understand energy more. And while I was doing really well at economics, I ended up doing very well in class. But I still didn't want to kind of go full time into theoretical economics and macro and so on. I was more interested in like sectoral kind of analysis, and energy was like the natural outcome of that. And I ended up studying, a subject which let me study energy and economics together for my postgrad. After which, of course, I've worked in a bunch of institutions, including TERI, including a private markets consultancy, which looked at emerging markets and sectoral kind of analysis within India. I worked at the Wuppertal Institute in Berlin on the Energiewende, the energy transitions there, and I've also worked at the Nansen Institute in Oslo, looking at the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, which is obviously based on oil. So it like a lot of my work started with oil and the traditional kind of energy sectors, but over the years, of course, it has evolved down to understanding the disruption, which is why we are talking about things like renewables and so on today. So yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't think I have depth into one thing, because I've seen people end up becoming experts through some rigorous work over the years on very specific aspects, I actually think that some of the most interesting things to me, are at the intersection of two or more disciplines. And I think that's where my role in energy is. I stand on the shoulders of giants who have already done some great work. I try to bring together different fields and try to make sense of it, which is where, be it my book or some of my recent work has kind of been based on. So yeah, I guess that's a very long story, but that's how I got here.
That's really excellent. I have like many follow-ups, but I guess I will start with one follow-up about like the movie that you mentioned, Syriana. Like, what exactly that inspired you in that movie? Like, was that like your point that energy is the sector you want to get into, or it was just like a fascinating movie to watch?
I think it was an introduction to me. I don't think that was a movie which kind of, after watching the movie, it was not that I decided that this is what I'm going to do, but it was very fascinating to me because that was a world that I had not really seen before, right? It was, it had, there are various aspects to it, but just watching consultants in the field of energy working with the royals in the Middle East to chart their courses of action, but they are unable to do so because of geopolitical reasons, because of Western powers having a presence in their countries, and the disproportionate influence that, say, large oil companies have in that part of the world, and how how strategic mergers and acquisitions can change the field of play. And of course, the nature of conflict itself, it's linked to terrorism, it's linked to state power. So understanding all of that and seeing how it links to energy and our just general quest to being more energy secure and so on, it was very fascinating to me. It made me want to read more. And I would say it definitely did play a role in me kind of charting this path. If I had not watched the movie, if I had watched something else, I don't know, maybe something else would have inspired me.
Did any of the scenes from the movie replay in real life for you when you entered into the sector? Because your early years, you said, were in the oil and gas sector.
Yes and no. There's one particular scene where there's a conversation that is being had by Matt Damon, along with the ruler of I don't know if it's a fictional country anymore because it's been a while since I watched the movie, but of a Middle Eastern country. And this particular royal is either the son or the nephew of the actual ruler, and he goes this Western young man goes up to the ruler to give him advice which he thinks is quite obvious, that why don't you invest in XYZ, and why don't you diversify your economy, and there were a bunch of things that he kind of advises. And then the royal kind of like hears him out. This is on the sand dunes while the royal is kind of playing with his eagles, and eventually the guy hears him out, and then he retorts that, you think I don't know all these things? I've also been educated in whatever, some American Ivy League university, and I know all of these things. It's just that the nature of the situation is such, with with the Western powers expecting us to buy arms, and then of course there's a bunch of things that he says in retort. And I think that scene is something I still remember, and I think it perhaps may have played out in different ways in reality at different points of time. It kind of shows how things that seem most obvious on paper aren't necessarily the way things kind of turn out in real life, which again in all through my research and writing, that is something I've really focused on. As an example, in my book, everyone knows largely where air pollution comes from, and therefore everyone kind of knows what needs to be done to kind of solve the problem. But if we know what the problem is, and if we know what the solution is, then why has it not been done already? And the answer to that lies in politics, it lies in geopolitics, it lies in economics and so on. So I think that is where I find things interesting, and that's the kind of stuff that I really like thinking about and solving, and trying to work through those kind of problems.
That's really fascinating. I mean, we have to bring you back someday to talk about the movie in more detail and your book, but uh, maybe let's get to the topic of today. So, we want to discuss the IEA's energy outlook, India Energy Outlook, that you were one of the co-authors. Um, and so, within that specifically, we want to discuss the urbanization and how that will shape the energy landscape in the country. I have this statistic from the report that over the period to 2040, an estimated 270 million people are likely to be added to India's urban population. And then there is a quote which really captured sort of my thinking. How fast India urbanizes and industrializes over the coming decades, and which policies govern these processes will be crucial for its energy future and for global trends. So tell us more about like how urbanization is linked to energy use, and if you can break it down into different sectors, that would be great.
Sure, of course. So, I'll firstly start with two disclaimers, and they're a bit long, so please bear with me. But then I promise you, once we're done with the disclaimers, for the rest of the conversation, things will flow a little, perhaps faster. So, first, let's just take a step back and think about urbanization itself. What exactly is it, and how is it defined in the Indian context, right? So, first to kind of just understand where India stands compared to other countries at the same level of incomes, same levels of per capita incomes. Of course, India today is 35%, urbanized, so to speak, like that. That's a percentage of population that lives in urban areas. But at the same per capita level, back in the day when China was at this level, China was about 40%, Korea was 50%, Japan was 65%. And today with higher per capita levels, these countries are anywhere between 55 to 90% urbanized. Whereas again, the numbers considered in our work are that by the year 2040, India would have barely reached 50%, right? Now, this could, of course, be in part due to how we define urban areas and the politics that is behind this. So Indian states have an incentive to label areas as rural because this enables them to receive certain subsidies and exemptions and benefits that they would otherwise not be entitled to, right? And of course, there are other kind of definitional issues of what percentage of population is reliant on agriculture or the primary sector, so to speak, and so on, which the data is not always up to date. It's not always current. It's based on censuses, which could be, which could have a lag of 10 years and so on, due to which I guess we may be underestimating the level of urbanization. So which kind of gets the point that we'll talk about a few numbers of what this means, later in our conversation, but it's probably much more than that, in the sense that the pace could be, even faster on the upside. Now, a related aspect to this is part of what we call rural areas have already started to look like urban areas. So again, not all of it, but portions of it. So, for example, even in my own village in Rajasthan, back in the day, most homes were made from cow dung and so on. Today, nearly all homes are used, made using pakka building materials, modern building materials, including cement, metals, and so on. In fact, even in our own analysis, I looked at NSSO data and kind of extracted some very useful information on how homes in rural areas have really, almost universally started using such modern building materials or energy intensive building materials today, compared to even 20 years ago, where it was, about half or so. Now, in addition to that, many, if not most houses have televisions now, even in rural areas. There's been a rapid uptake in various kind of appliances, refrigerators, coolers, and so on in certain parts of, of what we call as rural India. And of course, also motorcycles and cars. And also, I mean, just to say that the population that is dependent on agriculture has declined from 60% in 1930 to about 38% or less than 38% today, which means that there's been a massive shift towards non-agricultural professions. Due to all of this, I would say that, we need to kind of be careful about how we interpret urbanization in India's context. So that's my first, caveat or first disclaimer. The second is that nobody really knows the future. I mean, I guess that's a given, but, just to kind of run through what IEA's numbers for the future mean is that, they're basically, this IEA's work is scenario based, right? It's based on certain assumptions on, policy ambition, on GDP growth, population growth, technology development, cost, prices, and so on. Of course, depending on these assumptions, the numbers, for the future can potentially change. And therefore, it's important to remember the IEA's numbers are not predictions, right? They are scenario-based exercises, which still have value because it helps us understand how various facets of the energy economy kind of interact with each other and how we're able to, understand the implications of today's actions on tomorrow, right? So I would say, broadly, these are like my two disclaimers, and let me jump right into your question now. So coming back to what you had kind of brought up, owing to obviously migration and even recategorization of areas from rural to urban, we will see that there'll be a rapid decline in urban population. In fact, the number 270 million is about the equivalent of adding about 13 Mumbais, 13 cities the size of Mumbai, to India's urban population, or to India's population in general, by the year 2040. And on the other hand, rural population is set to decline by 40 million, right? So, we think of India as a country that is growing, population wise, but we don't see where it is growing. And I think where it is growing also, will obviously have an implication on energy use, emissions, and so on. And of course, this will fuel, energy demand in India in general. So by the year 2040, we see that energy, demand grows by 70%, right? And again, let me just kind of, add to the disclaimer that I had put there. All the numbers that I'm actually talking about right now are a part of the stated policy scenario, right? So this is like, there's no central scenario in the, IEA's works, but this is the scenario that we will consider for our conversation today, because it is based on a moderate, growth scenario, which looks at India's stated ambitions and sees to what extent can they actually be accomplished. Not all of them are accomplished, but to the extent possible. Perhaps later we can talk about the other scenarios, but for now, all my numbers are from this stated policy scenario, right? Now, talking about where this energy demand will come from urbanization, like just to kind of break it down, there are about 4 or 5 or maybe 6 key buckets of energy demand, so to speak. One is through construction itself. Floor space in urban India is expected to about triple by the year 2040, compared to today's level. Compared to that, in rural areas, the growth will not be that significant. Industries now, of course, industry needs to produce the materials and the products and the goods that will drive this construction activity and consumption in general in urban areas. Right? So energy demand from industry is expected to double in the next 20 years. Similarly, buildings itself, I'm talking about the appliances and lighting and air conditioning and so on within buildings. So electricity demand in buildings triples by the year 2040. Then there's, of course, cooking. In urban India, we have largely transitioned to LPG, but not fully. So, there'll be some kind of transitional impact from biomass to LPG. There's, of course, also, commercial spaces, which goes beyond buildings. It could include, cold chains and so on. And, finally, of course, there's transport, which is the big one. So, transport energy demand is expected to double, in over the next 20 years. And while the share of electricity will still remain low, so I know we'll be talking about electrification and so on, but even by the year 2040, less than 10% of energy demand from transport will be electricity. So perhaps also a little bit due to efficiency gains, but in general, we don't expect a massive electrification happening immediately in the field of transport. And this, of course, in general has an impact on air pollution, climate change, energy security, which we can get to at some point. But But in general, yeah, I would say these are the kind of major buckets that will drive energy demand growth from urbanization over the next 20 years.
You mentioned two, three very interesting things about urbanization. And before we jump into our main topic, which is the impact that it will have on energy demand, I wanted you to delve a little bit more on the urbanization part. You mentioned two, three things, and I can see a contrasting trend emerging when we talk about India's urbanization. You said that rural areas are increasingly looking like urban areas. But compared to other developed worlds, when they were at the same per capita income like India is, or at the GDP level, the urbanization was much more, if I may say, stronger. So, how do you define India's urbanization, if I can call so, or how do you see India's urbanization happening right now?
So, firstly, I mean, the government itself has a definition of what constitutes an urban area. And I mean, I don't have the definition at hand, but it has, a bunch of variables that contribute to it, including what share of people in any given neighborhood, work in the non-agricultural sector, or what, portion of the GDP and that the local GDP is based on that. Now, that may be inadequate as a measure because, like we said, it's already beginning to look like it in terms of, building materials, cars, roads, and so on. There have been other attempts at defining urbanization in India, which include things like, population density in any area. Again, that's also an interesting way to look at it. But then there are places in, for example, Bihar and UP where population density may be very, very high. But despite that, it may not be as urbanized as other, parts because I would say that they still don't visually look like the rural areas of other parts of the country. So, as an example, again, Goa has one of the highest urbanization rates in the country for a state. I mean, if you exclude Delhi and cities, it has one of the highest urbanization rates. But, again, in Goa, as you travel through the non-urban areas, like the villages don't really have a lot of people. In fact, even the urban parts don't have a lot of people. Therefore, population density itself may not kind of fully do the trick. So I don't really know what the best way to kind of resolve this problem is. I feel that India really deserves a deep dive, full-fledged study on what constitutes urbanization. And I think if we are able to come up with a few interesting numbers, it will really change even our own modeling outputs. What we think of as energy demand that could arise 20 years later could really be dependent on how we are able to redefine, what it means to be urbanized. So, I mean, I would say that in general, as we move, forward, as people's, ability to earn more and therefore consume more increases, our networks as far as our supply chains and so on go are quite strong even in villages. Like you have Amazon delivering anywhere in any part of the country. So the nature of consumption has also changed, and I think it'll be very hard to distinguish if you're in a neighborhood in a rural area versus a particular neighborhood in urban areas. It may be very hard to distinguish unless you're in a high rise kind of city. For most other urban areas, it'll be very hard to distinguish between urban and rural areas in the country. So we may be relying too much on where a panchayat is as opposed to where a municipal corporation is for our understanding of what urban versus rural means. And I think that thinking needs to change.
I think this disparity in definition, which you said that there's no clear model, also then impacts, energy access solutions available to these new areas becoming urban areas, right? If it's a rural area or something, states mostly have this idea that they should be given 18 hours of supply, defined supply, but they would be needing more probably, or the demand would be higher than what that particular power distribution company thinks of, or for that matter, LPG distributor. So I think this modeling will also help in energy planning, if I may say so.
Absolutely. I mean, you've already identified a couple of ways this could impact our thinking. I'm sure there are many others. This includes, for example, think of piped supply of natural gas for cooking. It's usually it's concentrated in urban areas, right? But maybe redefinitions or recategorization of areas could help us identify more neighborhoods, more places where such supplies can be made. And there are many others. I mean, ideally, we should not even be thinking about 18 hours a day versus whatever, because there are 24 hours in a day, and everyone deserves to kind of access all of it. But yeah, I think just having good, accurate numbers really helps in decision making. This is also where some of our work comes in, because devoid of it, you'd perhaps be making worse decisions. So while we don't predict the future, at least hopefully this helps understand a bit of it.
Fantastic. So, I mean, I want to pick one of the topics, one of the subtopics that you mentioned as one of the buckets of urban energy demand, which is the construction, right? So a bunch of this construction will happen using steel, cement, and other materials. And right now, the way we produce those is using coal. So what happens to sort of the coal demand for coal in India? Like, I mean, as you know, like everybody wants India's coal sector to decline. So what are the implications of this construction activity and urbanization on coal demand going forward?
So I mean, I think you have pretty much hit the nail on the key aspect of the debate, because coal is the big focus, especially for a country like India, which largely relies on it, not just in terms of the energy sector, but also in terms of providing jobs. Your own research has talked about how many districts in the country are kind of reliant on the coal economy. So I think it's very important to understand where coal, goes from here. Again, like I said, we're talking about our main, scenario case. This could change drastically depending on what policies we choose to pursue. But just trying to step back a little bit and understanding where this coal demand will come from. To first understand how industry is going to evolve from here. I mean, just to say that over the next 20 years, as India, perhaps will grow at a average GDP rate of about 5% or so per annum. This could fuel significant construction activity, which we just described, over tripling of the spaces. In fact, just imagine this for a second, by the way. You're either based in India or even if you're not, you can imagine an Indian city. Now imagine 3 times as many buildings or 3 times as many floors. That's the kind of, this is what it could potentially mean, in terms of what urban spaces could look like 20 years from now, right? This would imply that steel production would need to triple, over the next 20 years for us to kind of satiate that demand. Similarly, steel production also increases by a factor of 2.5, right? And now, it's very hard for this industrial sector to be electrified. To like solar and wind may not be able to service this kind of demand, due to which, of course, CO2 demand from industry as a whole could double by 2040 again, which is huge. Other countries are already looking at ways of reducing emissions, but in India, for the industrial sector, it is doubling by the year 2040. Now, the government has this ambitious plan for natural gas, and the idea is that this natural gas will replace, coal in industry and in other applications. But we see that even, at least in our analysis, that even while natural gas demand from industry quadruples in the next 20 years, coal demand will still double, right? So and at the same time, coal demand from the power generation side remains largely stagnant. It does not really grow from today's levels, assuming that the coal-fired power plants from today continue to be on board. There are no early retirements, and there are a few more that may come on board. But on the whole, the demand from the power generation side remains the same. But overall, coal demand still continues to rise in India, and so India may not be able to fully transition away from being a coal-based energy economy over the next 2 decades at least. So yeah, I mean, I guess this also kind of, in a way, raises the debate on where or how India sees itself as a future industrial power, in a way, right? The question is that can a country like India develop on the backs of services, or do we need a huge manufacturing base? Whether the world can absorb a second China in terms of what India could potentially produce in the future. And this will have a major impact on whether our coal demand rises further, or we are able to kind of meet our decarbonization pledges and so on. I mean, already, unfortunately, this Make in India has not really succeeded so far, in that the objective was to create 100 million new jobs by the year 2022. But we have seen that, as a whole, the manufacturing jobs have not really increased, over the past few years. In fact, the share of manufacturing in GDP was to rise to 25% by 2022. It has been at 17% for the past few years. So I guess, unfortunately, the economy is kind of answering that question as to whether India will be an industrial power in the future. But it's also a debate we must have in terms of our planning for how we envisage our way forward.
Right. I guess the second impact that you also talked about would be through these electronic appliances and everything as urbanization increases. Also mentioned in your introductory note that as more and more urbanization reaches areas, rural areas, and the new cities, people are adopting appliances, be it AC, be it fridge. But this particular increased usage is coming at a time when India as a country is battling extreme weathers, climate change, and everything. So while this energy demand is increasing, which for a certain section is good news, but for the larger good of the climate, if I may talk about it's not. And I don't think with this with the way urbanization is happening in the country, planning is not happening that way. So you don't have much energy efficient appliances going there, or be it energy efficient buildings. So I wanted to understand that how does a country like India, which is taking nascent steps in climate change mitigation, balance these two things, the growing energy needs and these particular issues, the impact that it has.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, let me just start with a few numbers, just to kind of see the quantum of the change. So while, of course, historically, especially in urban India, most homes today, of course, apart from, lighting and fans and so on, most homes already have televisions, and refrigerators have also become, very, very common in urban India. Not so common in rural India, but at least in urban India, it's kind of, almost universal. But the one appliance that we are projecting will rise more than any others, in fact will have huge demand on or huge impact rather on energy demand, is the rise of air conditioners, right? So by the year 2040, so today ACs are barely prevalent. I guess in terms of the households, the coverage of household, it's still in the single digits, or perhaps in the double digits for India, but it has just crossed that kind of barrier. But by the year 2040, we would see more ACs per households than any other of these big appliances like TVs and fridges and so on. AC usage will also become more broad-based, right? So ACs in urban areas have largely been used by high-income households. Of course, I mean that's not surprising, but this will change significantly. A study by IEEE, which is a think tank based in Delhi, according to them, by the year 2028 or 2030, let's say, about half of urban households would have air conditioners, compared to just 6% of rural households, right? So, in fact, in urban areas, lower and middle income groups would have 10 times as much air conditioning stock as rich households by the year 2030. Of course, these numbers could change because these projections were made pre-pandemic. You can, change the year 2030 to some other year. But point is that, you'd see that air conditioning becomes more kind of, universal in a way. Of course, there are many factors that lead to it. The urban heat island effect, where of course urban areas have higher temperatures compared to surrounding areas, due to the nature of the roads and the material usage and so on. Of course, this is being made worse by climate change as a whole. So, the summers are hotter and so on. And of course, we have, terribly poor, building design these days. Back in the day, without ACs or even fans, you had to deal with higher ceilings and, other, thermally efficient ways of designing buildings. Today, everyone knows you can have an AC, so you can just make the least efficient non-insulated cement building, and without having to think of thermal kind of the nature of the building itself. And this presents a huge impact on energy demand. So while of course we're talking about appliances as a whole, simply because air conditioners as appliances take a huge chunk of that energy demand, I'm just focusing on it. But you can pretty much dump TVs and fridges and whatever else along with air conditioners, and it would not have that much of a change in the implications of it as far as energy is concerned, as far as emissions are concerned. So as per our analysis, by 2040, the difference between between the lowest and the highest air conditioning load through the course of a single day, on the grid is about 200 gigawatts compared to about 40 gigawatts today, right? So a 5x increase on the grid, on like as an impact on the grid, right? Now, due to this, of course, firstly, because of this variation, like an intraday variation in demand as well as supply, of course, due to solar and wind and so on, India will also become a global leader in batteries. We expect that the Indian grid will need a lot of batteries, because the nature of the flexibility requirement is best served by batteries, as opposed to other countries where they may have more seasonal variations. For example, they may need heating in the winters in Europe, which you don't need as much in India. So I guess because the intraday nature of our flexibility demand, it is batteries that may end up succeeding at the marketplace in India, of course, with good policies and so on. But in general, I guess there's no easy answer to this. You've already kind of mentioned energy efficiency, right? I mean, I think that's a no-brainer. Again, as per our analysis, residential peak cooling demand could be reduced up to 25 gigawatts on an intraday basis only through energy efficiency. So energy efficiency does play a huge role, in this. But apart from this, we need to think of non-AC ways of cooling buildings as well. And that is something that we have not given enough thought. And you obviously mentioned building design as well, and I would add to that, there's also behavioral aspects. Which, what temperatures do you really need households or offices to be at, and so on. I mean, in general, the answers seem very obvious, but, practically what this means is that we really need to invest into ensuring that we have built the capacity, firstly, so that people are able to understand, what is needed, and we're able to find the right technicians and the right kind of people who are able to invest into this. So we have way more IITs than we have skills institutes that have more basic kind of training on such things. I think energy efficiency should also be taught at at skills institutes for electricians and mechanics and so on and so forth. That's something that perhaps is not being done enough. And we also need government capacity to actually enforce this. We have way too few people who deal with energy and buildings energy efficiency in general. So I think that is something that we really need to kind of invest on. Then the more obvious things will actually be implementable if we actually have that capacity.
This topic of air conditioner is so fascinating, and anybody who's lived in India can imagine, especially in a place like Delhi, it's so hot and humid during summers. I was wondering, I mean, here, where I'm living in Canada, there was a heat wave recently, and, people started talking about heat pumps as a solution. I don't know if you have thought about that, or like the heat pumps as a solution for a place like India. Perhaps it could take off some of the load of air conditioners.
If you want to sell heat pumps in India, you will have to change the name. the moment you tell heat pumps in an Indian audience, they're like, we don't need more heat. We have enough heat. Of course, a heat pump pumps heat, away from, or I mean, it's reversible. But the point is that I think we need to kind of maybe rebrand it as a cold pump or something like that. Maybe that could do the trick. So yeah, I mean, in general, yes, I think there needs to be some effort on this. When I was looking for an air conditioner a couple of years ago, I actually looked at the options of heat pumps and so on. In India, you just don't have good options for this, and therefore, unless something comes to the marketplace, until if it's not coming naturally, then perhaps the government needs to incentivize this somehow. But yeah, I think we need to think out of the box when it comes to such things. I as an example, I in at Terry's Terry, which is the Energy and Resources Institute, the think tank based in Delhi, at Terry's Gwalpahari campus. So they have a campus outside Delhi. They have this innovative way of cooling their block, which as you enter it, even at the peak of the summer, it's about 25 degrees, which is very comfortable. You don't really need it to be at 16 or 17 or 18. It's actually very comfortable to be in there. It is cooled without a single air conditioner. So what they're basically doing is they're pumping air, regular air, to about I don't know the precise number, but say 5 or 10 feet below the ground, because the temperature there is more stable. It's about 25 degrees. So there's some heat transfer that takes place, and then the same air is pumped out. So it's literally just fans and something that takes the air underground and back up, and that is leading to like a very ambient kind of thermal atmosphere. We really need to think about these things and ways to really commercialize it. I mean, if you're going to ask people to do this for the goodness of their heart, they will not do it, right? It needs to win at the marketplace. It needs to be something cool. Like the product needs to look good. It can't look like someone's trying to sell some appendage to your building. It's going to look ugly, requires maintenance. We don't need that. We need something that can genuinely be attractive to people, and I think we can do it. This number that I think about it at times, the cooling demand from the energy demand from cooling alone in the year 2040 in India will be equal to the total electricity requirement in Germany today. So we'll be adding a Germany just from cooling, and it's absurd, but at the same time, thermal comfort is also a human right, and you can't deny that to people. But perhaps there are better ways of getting there.
If I may ask something here, we are discussing two very interesting things. One is energy efficiency, and second is the architecture of spaces. Two things that I'm very fascinated about. The Gwalpahari campus I've visited. IIT Kanpur also has a similar design. That brings me to my first question. This whole pressure of being energy efficient over the years in terms of policy in India has always been on commercial establishments. But as per the numbers that you've shared, how residential demand will come up, how do you make energy efficiency lucrative for, residential segment? Not till yet we have seen this LED scheme where people were pushed to buy LED because the cost was coming down. So cost was a factor. Then there were certain schemes which said that you will save money on your electricity bill. So apart from that, could you think of any other incentives that could push the residential segment towards energy efficiency?
Firstly, I think there is no know-how. I think it's as simple as that. Most people don't know it. Like I've had conversations with friends who say, oh, I live on the top floor of a building in Delhi, and my bills in the peak summer season are X high, or like absurd numbers, right? And I tell them, look, why don't you just get some very simple thermal kind of roofing done, and replace your windows. There are these low E glasses and so on, which can kind of help you reduce the cooling requirements. In fact, very other basic things, like there's a lot of seepage that happens of the air because our doors are not really that well made. We have a lot of gaps between our doors and windows. It's very common in Indian households. These are very simple things to deal with, but they require investments. But there is firstly no know-how. Like people need to know the right words and the right terms when they look up Amazon, or where they tell their maybe carpenter or electrician to kind of fix these things. that vocabulary does not exist in the people. And I really think we need a education campaign in general so that people are aware. Secondly, I think we need to have the right kind of investment, or financing rather, financing mechanisms for households, right? So if I'm already paying, as an example, if I'm paying 7,000 rupees per month on electricity because of high air conditioning costs, if my discom is able to say that, look, we are going to perhaps do 2 or 3 retrofits to your building, you will still continue to pay 7,000 and nothing else. You don't have to do anything about it. It's on the house. But after 3 years, you can stop paying that 7,000 and your bill is going to go down. And, basically a way to ensure that without costing anything extra for you, you're able to kind of retrofit your buildings or design new buildings which are more energy efficient. Those kind of financing mechanisms need to exist in place, which just don't exist in India. LED succeeded because we just purchased them at bulk and sold them at bulk. But it's harder to sell roofs, at bulk. Nobody's buying roofs at a marketplace. So that's the kind of challenge I guess we need to overcome.
Okay, I mean, I feel like I could talk about air conditioner and cooling all day, but let's move on to the next one, which is the transport, right? Urban transport is going to be such a huge, with around 270 million people, according to your estimate. I'm not taking the number, but, plus minus number of people being added. We'll need massive transport infrastructure, but also and thinking a little bit from an emissions point of view, we want to have greener transport rather than continue with the internal combustion engines. And so, could you speak to what what energy demand would look like from a transport point of view, and if you can also talk a little bit about the emission side of things, if we don't do it well.
Of course, I know. Firstly, kind of let's just understand how urban India travels currently, right? So, how do people move about? A recent study by CEW, which is a think tank based in Delhi, shows that most trips, most daily commutes, or not just daily, any commutes for that matter, are short. So they are just a couple or maybe 2 or 3 kilometers in length, right? And secondly, most short trips are not motorized. So we are talking about, a significant chunk of people who are moving about without using, oil, without being reliant on fossil fuels or electricity or whatever else. Then a lot of the medium length trips, so to speak, about 10 kilometers or 7 kilometers or so, are done using two-wheelers, right? And most people travel within this kind of distance. So most people are not really, traveling long distances. This sounds like a good thing, but again, to kind of repeat that point, people aren't doing this due to the goodness of their hearts. They're not doing this for environmental reasons. India is still, of course, an emerging country, right? Our analysis shows that as Indians become richer, they will switch to four-wheelers, or in fact, motorized two-wheelers for that matter. But importantly, by the year 2040, as per our scenario, the stock of cars triple from today's numbers, right? Whereas motorcycles only grow about 50% from today's numbers, because India is one of perhaps the largest, if not the second largest market for two-wheelers in the world already. Which means that, again, with wealth, people will transition towards four-wheelers as opposed to say electric two-wheelers, or as opposed to, public transport and so on, right? As of course you've rightly pointed out, this has a major implication on emissions from transport. We expect that, CO2 emissions from this sector will double. And along with this, we will also find that the value of oil imports will triple by the year 2040. So India's already, let's not forget, we already spend, billions of dollars just importing, fossil fuels, oil in particular, and this will triple in monetary terms. Of course, along with this, there's also an impact on air pollutants, and that goes without saying. Despite, of course, moving towards cleaner fuels and cleaner technologies and electrification, despite that, as a whole, a lot of India's like urban India's air pollution problem, comes from dust, comes from things that are not necessarily, based on burning fuel. So that will still increase as there are more vehicles on the road, right? So that's not going away anytime soon. Now, to move people, from to move people to public or non-motorized transport will not be easy, right? So the issue is that historically, we have never really considered the comforts of people, because we always, we are a poor country, or emerging country rather, and therefore our infrastructure, our spending priorities are such that, for the poor, we have the worst of buses and the worst of bus stops and trains and so on. But honestly, this is a really major component of energy demand and emissions, and India should take it seriously because it could impact India in more ways than one. We must consider the comforts of people, because that is what will ensure that people continue to use public transport as opposed to purchase private transport modes. We need to think about interoperability, between different modes. We need to think about overcrowding. We need to think about safety. Again, take the case of Mumbai locals. Hundreds of people die every single year due to as trains run over people, and that should not be acceptable by anyone. Safety also means the safety of women. Of course, if you have crowded public transport, that's not really the safest way for women to get about. And like in general, of course, our roads are also congested, which makes it an issue for even buses to move about. So we need to think about comfort very seriously, and I think that will really make an impact in people transitioning to this, rather than just using it due to the lack of other alternatives. And again, it's not rocket science at all. It's just a question of just scale, integration, comforts, like the very basic things. To add to this, there may be some conditions that are unique to India which don't exist in other countries. So we may need to get innovative about it. Again, these are not tried and tested solutions, but just as I think about it, perhaps our bus stops need to have thermal insulation, just to make sure that people in the peak of the summer, when it's 45 or 50 degrees outside, bus stops perhaps cannot be air conditioned universally, or maybe they can even, but we need to think of ways to make it comfortable for people. These are things that other countries don't really have to think about. We may need to think about solarizing cycle and walking tracks, to ensure that there's some shade at the top. Of course, trees are ideal, but if trees are hard to plant, if we are not able to reach that scale, then at the very least we could perhaps generate some electricity, or basically find ways to make sure that people are comfortable as they walk around, as they use public transport. Something that European countries don't really have to think about, but I think India will need to.
Honestly, I had never thought about it from a comfort point of view, but it's a really fascinating point, because you see the conditions of sort of like how people travel, and comfort is the last of concern, right? So glad we covered such interesting topics. But let's talk about emissions, right? Climate change is real, and we need to take bold climate action. And one of the presentations I had seen of you guys giving, and you really nicely articulated how India is at the center of global energy demand, and perhaps what India does in terms of taking climate action has implications for global emissions. So could you give us a big picture perspective of what all of this means from an emissions point of view, urbanization and demand for air conditioner and vehicles and so on?
So look, just to kind of elaborate further on the point that you made, it's one of the kind of key central points that is often made by IEA and IEA's leadership, that India will has in fact arrived at the center of the global energy conversation and demand for energy. This is because over the last 20 years, the largest center for energy demand growth was China. But for the next 20 years, the largest center for energy demand growth will be India. more than China, more than Japan, more than Southeast Asia as a whole, more than Africa, more than South America. So, so really the way India is able to ensure that it is able to meet this massive growth in energy demand in an efficient, sustainable manner is really the major challenge for not just India but for the world. No, so therefore goes without saying, but all eyes will be on India, and especially on India because India is a developing economy. It's a growing economy. Our per capita incomes are still below the world average. So if India is able to successfully demonstrate that it's possible, this would be great news for other countries of the world, and perhaps India can even find markets in those countries for newer technologies and not just technologies but even cultural things like policies and so on, because we often like to talk about how India succeeded on the LED front, and it's something that an emerging market economy somewhere else may identify better with a country like India than it would with a Norway or a Germany or something. Now, to talk about emissions in India, we can't just talk about one scenario. Now, so far, everything we've been talking about is through the stated policy scenario, as I had initially talked about. I will now introduce you to the other scenarios. Hopefully, it doesn't get too complex with too many numbers, but I nonetheless will run through it because this is at the center of IEA scenario building work, right? So, stated policy scenario is what we were discussing so far. The second scenario in consideration is the India Vision Case, IVC. So, the India Vision Case is a scenario which considers a higher GDP growth rate, right, and a more fuller, but not complete, but more fuller completion of its targets. India has very grand targets on a lot of things, coal, natural gas, electricity, and so on, electric vehicles. So it considers a more fuller completion because even the growth rate is higher. The third scenario is the delayed response scenario, DRS. So this scenario looks at a situation where there are prolonged impacts of COVID on the economy, due to which India's growth rate, continues to kind of remain lower than what we would expect a moderate growth rate country to look like. This is a scenario where perhaps it's taken longer for us to fully vaccinate people. Perhaps there are more waves. Perhaps there are more lockdowns in the future, right? And finally, we look at the SDS, or the Sustainable Development Scenario. This scenario is the one that is most consistent with the targets of the Paris Agreement to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So this final scenario is more like a top-down scenario where we kind of think of the end point, which is decarbonization, and then walk back to see how to get there. Where the other scenarios are the ones where we look at conditions as they exist today and then try to see how they play out into the future, right? So very quickly going through these scenarios in terms of energy use, what it means in terms of activity, and finally what it means in terms of emissions, right? So we'll start with steps, which again, as I've discussed before, but I'll repeat again. Energy use will grow by 70% over the next 2 years, 2 decades. So everything I'm talking about is 2040, right? So energy demand grows by 70%, while emissions grow by only 45% from today's standards, because obviously the emission intensity improves in India's case as with other countries. In this scenario, again, as I've already discussed, but to repeat very quickly, vehicle stock doubles, floor space more than doubles, iron steel production either triples or close to triples. Air conditioners go from 30 million to about 670 million by the year 2040. This is also the scenario where biomass use, while it reduces, it still continues in rural areas alongside LPG. So, there is fuel stacking. Households use biomass along with LPG. So this is the stated policy scenario, the one that we have been discussing so far. The India Vision Case has GDP growth which is about a couple of percentage points higher than the stated policy scenario. So this is actually a scenario where the GDP, the size of the GDP itself, is about 15% larger, 15% larger in the year 2040 compared to the stated policy scenario, right? So if we are talking about a much bigger pie. But despite this larger economy, energy demand is actually lower. It's lower by about 5% compared to the stated policy scenario in the year 2040. This is because, with greater wealth, India will be able to better invest in energy efficient technologies. It will better be able to, work on implementation, as there'll be more state capacity to kind of, think about how to make some of these targets happen, more focus on buildings, and things that are harder to kind of deal with, otherwise. And of course, in this scenario, also, India would have fully transitioned away from biomass, and by 2030 already everyone would be using LPG or electricity or whatever else for cooking, which also is more efficient than biomass. So although cooking is still happening, but the fuel that cooks it is becoming more efficient, right? And due to this, overall emissions are 10% lower than the stated policy scenario. So, to kind of quickly summarize, with a 15% larger economy, India can have 10% lower emissions simply because with a bigger GDP, we can invest further into, things that make us use energy more efficiently. Next, we'll talk about the delayed response scenario. So this is the COVID one, the one that kind of, in fact, the funny story here is that when we published the IEO, this was, in February this year, we, at that time we were just having peer reviews just before that. And, a few peer reviewers kind of pointed out that, why do you even need this scenario? COVID is already behind. India's, cases are falling. Our economy is improving, and you're just wasting your time with this. And then the second wave hit, and here we are, where the scenario that we had discarded, not discarded, but at least mentally we didn't really focus too much on it. But now we need to, because the future is uncertain. Anyway, in this scenario, the size of the economy is 10% smaller than the stated policy scenario in the year 2040, right? Because of course the growth rate is slower, and COVID comes in waves and things like that. As a result of this, emissions are also 10% lower compared to the stated policy scenario. So again, in a way, this kind of illustrates, the difference between the India vision case and the demand, the delayed recovery scenario, looks at, the point it makes is that it's not the GDP alone that has an impact on emissions. It's not that higher GDP always means higher emissions. It's what you do with this. It's how you kind of, are able to fulfill your policy ambitions and so on. And we definitely don't want the latter scenario. We don't want a scenario where we have both lower GDP and lower emissions. We would rather have higher GDP and lower emissions, which is what we should be kind of aiming for. The final scenario that I'd like to talk about is the sustainable development scenario. This is the scenario where India goes to net zero by the year by about, in the mid 2060s, without picking a single year. It's in the mid 2060s. While India goes to net zero by the mid 2060s, I will focus on the year 2040 only, because that's where, we really have things to talk about. So, in this scenario, energy demand is still 20% larger than it is today. So I'm not talking about, I'm not comparing it with steps and all that. Compared to today, energy demand is still higher, right? But despite this, emissions under this scenario are 60% lower than even today, right? So despite having 20% more energy use, emissions are 60% lower, because there are significant investments into clean energy technologies, into electric vehicles, into grids, into batteries, into solar, into all of that, right? A very interesting point that emerges, and this is not a scientific argument about, allocating resources and so on, but it's still interesting, is that, remember when I said that under the stated policy scenario, fossil fuel import bill will triple in value, by the year 2040. So basically, pursuing the sustainable development path, India can bring down the cumulative value of its fossil fuel imports by $1.4 trillion. And now it so happens, coincidentally, this is not a relationship between this and anything else, but coincidentally, that is also the amount of investments we need into clean energy technologies under the sustainable development scenario to basically have lower emissions. So it takes 1.4 million US dollars to get there, and if we get there, we can avoid 1.4 million US dollars of outflow from the Indian economy for fossil fuel imports. Right. Again, to reiterate, it's not a one for one, but it's still an interesting outcome that they both kind of look similar to each other. So yeah, I mean, I guess sorry for bombarding you and all the listeners with so many numbers, but I hope it gives some perspective as to the direction of of the economy, the direction that we want to pursue in general. Just to summarize, we want high growth, we want more development. We love energy, but we don't like emissions. So that's the path we should actually be pursuing.
That's fantastic. I mean, this week, one of my paper is coming out where we also looked at a bunch of Paris goal scenarios and stuff. One thing I just wanted to ask you, and you don't have to answer this question if you're not comfortable with, is what do you think India will likely follow the path? I mean, these are scenarios. I completely get it, all the caveats. But this is not to IEA, this is the question to Siddharth. Like, what do you think, given, you're looking at policy space very closely, you interact with research community, and you're seeing what's going on in India. What is the likely scenario India is likely to follow? Forget about 2040. Let's talk about next 5 years.
I fully understand your question, and I think again, as you kind of rightly framed it, I speak for myself now, and in general, as somebody who's been operating in this space for a while, interacting with policymakers as well as the industry and so on. Look, firstly, just to kind of talk about the fact that a lot of our decisions are based on things that go beyond good intention, right? The intention always will be that we want to do great things and we don't want to pollute and we want to do all those things. But in reality, what we know best is that you can quickly set up a polluting industry and create jobs than to find complex financing mechanisms to fund a clean energy industry. And investing into innovation is harder to do than investing into a more simple textile mill and so on. So I would say that India's developmental considerations will trump any consideration for clean energy transitions. This is not to say that clean energy transition leads to losses in jobs, because that's debatable. And again, depending on the study, you will see that on the net you could create more jobs through a well managed transition. Of course, that would still mean that people get disrupted, but that's beside the point. I'm just talking about in overarching numbers. But like I said, our thinking is still attuned to the old ways of doing things, and for those reasons, I think that the path that we will pursue will not be the most aggressive one. It will be the one where where we don't have climate at the heart of our discourse on industrial policy or transport or whatever else. Our focus will be on providing the maximum we can in the shortest time possible, and climate considerations will be secondary, and it'll come most likely after the investment has already been made.
Now that we are on the subject of you sharing your perspective, I will take this chance and I want to ask you, how do you imagine the future landscape of this country vis-a-vis urban areas? And I ask this from both the side of real estate and transport. These two areas are moving in a very divergent way. The transport sector has woken up to the the business revenue ideas of green transport, green fuels and everything. The real estate sector, I don't think has, correct me if I'm wrong, also maybe because it's less regulated. So going forward, how do you imagine this landscape, India's urban landscape, to be? And do you think it would be business growth that would be driving it and not policies? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. Firstly, India does not really have great institutions that help plan urban areas. If you think about the planned cities, India has not really been able to create, new metropolises, so to speak. Besides a few pockets here and there through our history, we have ideas for smart cities and so on, but in reality, we are just making existing cities smarter. There are not many greenfield, kind of activities happening on that front. I mean, not to say that it's not needed. I'm glad that there is, smartness to the way even existing cities operate. At least to the extent that is possible. But in general, the way urbanization itself is happening, and specifically the way the real estate sector is kind of evolving, I think this will prove to be one of India's biggest challenges over the next 20 years, or in fact even longer. India just does not have the state capacity to actually implement existing laws. Secondly, the existing laws have not even been notified by the different municipal corporations and different states and districts and so on. So you may have the central government, working with either international think tanks or with, even domestic think tanks to come up with progressive regulations on energy efficiency and material use and so on. But, the moment you leave that layer, you will find that the know-how, the existence of a dedicated agency to deal with it, or the presence of experts are very minimal. It's literally at the bare minimum. So I would say that is the one major challenge. Apart from, if I could add one or two others to the list, this is not related to urbanization, but in general, I would say that, freight transport is another big, like road freight transport is another big, hard to abate, so to speak, hard to abate sector. Certain aspects of industry are also hard to abate. Other things are generally easier. But, like you said, the conversation on transport is, is moving towards electrification and, green and so on. But that's not true for real estate at all. I think it's kind of, it's sad in a way that, something that is going to be in place for much longer is the one that has the least, amount of regulation or, actual market activity towards greater efficiency. Buildings could last as much as 100 years, whereas a car, I mean, it's fine. It's hard to, it's hard to kind of decarbonize, or rather to, remove inefficient cars from the roads, but they'll be gone in 10-15 years anyway, right? But buildings that are yet to be built, or the ones that are being built now, are going to last for a lifetime and beyond. So I'm very, very concerned about this sector more than any other. I think the nature of construction that we have seen in Noida, Gurgaon, and so on, where it is perhaps a little planned, but buildings are just coming out from anywhere and not really the most efficient. That is what I expect will continue to happen across the country.
Excellent. Yeah, it seems like problematic that the conversation in the real estate space has not started. But we know that in the mobility space, the conversation is very much there. India has plans for all kinds of different vehicles and so on and so forth. But are you satisfied with the conversation? I like how you framed that, with the help of international think tanks, or like the know-how in Delhi, if I can call it, is towards the right policies and regulations and so on. But like, how do you manage transition smaller towns and cities to smarter mobility choices? I know that two-wheelers could become a good choice, but what about cars and other forms of public transport and so on? It would be interesting to know your thoughts about that from a transport point of view.
Yeah, so I think for any transition to succeed, you not only need intention and government support, but you also need the market to come up with solutions. We need technologies, we need things to look appealing to people. India has had electric cars for decades now. We had Reva, but if you weren't an environmentalist, you would not want to be seen with one, and that's just the reality of of the vehicle itself. I mean, I'm glad that it exists. I've myself used a Reva in the past. I'm not personally, but my organization used to have one, so I used to drive around in it. But what's happening in like recent years is that, or in fact, what is planned to happen in the coming years is that companies are coming up with desirable products to the market. There's a lot of competition among different startups that want to provide solutions that go beyond the product itself. So, the companies that want to provide a service in the form of how you charge your vehicle, and, maybe there's interoperability, between different networks and companies. So there's a lot of competition in that space. It's not that the government kind of enabled this. This also happened on the backs of what is happening in other countries where electric vehicles may have, kicked up pace due to other reasons, and the fall in lithium ion battery prices, the improvements in technologies, the, uptake in China and Europe, which kind of has spurred interest in other countries. That's not true for a lot of other sectors. So I would say that, India's electric kind of vehicle revolution, so to speak, of course, is very slow. Again, the government does provide subsidies, but the government will have to provide a lot more for it to be viable as a product today. And in India, you can't justify that because you're basically, subsidizing the rich or the upper middle classes, which is perhaps not the best thing to do. But having said that, I think give it a few more years when we see electric vehicle compete with the internal combustion engine vehicle at the point of purchase in terms of prices. This may happen in a few years. Once that is to happen, I think there'll be a tipping point reached and things will look very, very different in the future. But in general, I think India being in the current, developmental trajectory, we should not be overly worried about inefficient vehicles that already exist. Other countries have the equivalents of, cash for clunkers, where you can purchase inefficient vehicles and replace them basically, or the government basically, gives you some money for early retirements. India can't do that. It's just a bad look to pay the rich to give up their vehicles. So we may as well think about the future as far as transport goes. In general, like I said, we need scale and comfort. Let the government India should just purchase buses left, right, and center. It does not even matter if it's not electric, like just literally buses. They're efficient. Let them be air conditioned. Let them be close to free. And you will see that people will be more than happy to use them over purchasing personal vehicles.
Apart from public transport, real estate, and everything, I just wanted to quickly ask about what role, public spaces can play in both climate mitigation and also making urban areas more energy efficient. This is my observation that public spaces in India compared to Western worlds are not given that much importance. And these could be a trailblazer, I believe, in changing the mindset of the public towards having energy efficient structures or anything. Quickly, what are your thoughts on that? And do you think that, if we plan them that way, probably that could, pave the way for better planning across the areas?
So, there's this kind of meme that I read on the internet a few days ago. The question asked was that, why aren't kids going outdoors these days? Why are they always stuck indoors? And the response was, have you looked at the outdoors we have created? And there was a picture of, huge roads. The playgrounds were barely existent. There are barbed wires everywhere. And that's the urban setup, the public spaces, so to speak, that we have created. Of course, kids won't want to go out. I mean, it's neither safe, it's not fun, it's not spacious enough. And of course, there's a pull factor with other technologies and so on. But point is, we have not created the necessary kind of public infrastructure that drives people outside. And I always, like in Delhi, for example, I really truly enjoy being in the India Habitat Center because I think it's genuinely a very well designed building. When you go there, even on a hot day, for some reason it is less hot than than being anywhere else. It's just the way it has been kind of designed makes me feel that this is how construction can happen. It helps me visualize it. And of course, I mean, if you don't have the option of seeing for yourself what efficient building and design and public spaces look like, you will not be able to replicate that at your household level, right? So, but again, it comes back to the same thing. India being a poor country, what can we really invest on? And can something like this even be centralized? I don't think so. Not everything can be centralized. The unique conditions that exist for a city will or a town will exist only there in those states and those climatic conditions. And not every state has the need to create one. Again, it comes down to the, I guess, income levels and mindsets of the ruling politicians in those places and administrators in those places. So I think this is one of the harder to do kind of things. If there were things that are easier to do, simpler things like subsidies or market design by policies, those are easier things to do. Things that require more planning, more, like long-term kind of thinking are harder to do. So again, it's not something I'm very confident about, but hopefully that changes. Let's see.
Well, thank you so much, Siddharth. This was just such a fascinating conversation. We covered so many different topics. Yeah, really appreciate your time.
No, thanks so much, Sandeep and Shreya. I've, like I said, I've learned a lot from your own work over the years, and I'm really glad that we could have this conversation today. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Thanks a lot. Thank you again. I didn't even thought that we would cover so much ground, but we did. So it's just very good.
Yeah, I mean, you had some great questions, so I had to kind of scribble down a few notes and stuff. But yeah, this was very interesting. Thank you.
For more information about the podcast, visit us online at www.101reporters.com/podcast/the_India_energy_hour. You can also reach out to us on social media and send us your comments and suggestions. My Twitter handle is @SandeepPai with a double I, and Shreya's Twitter handle is @Shreya_J.